So hi, this is Craig and Richard for our week 2 feedback video from Monash. Again, lots of great comments this week, lots of really interesting conversation happening on the forum, and again, we're just going to share some of those highlights.
Yeah. So one of the first things that came up, there was questions about the freeze response, and because we have fight or flight, and actually women have a tend and befriend response, which is a bit different, but the freeze response, and this is interesting because really there are two kinds of freeze response. Because if you're a small furry animal and you're cornered by a bear coming around a corner, then the freeze response is like a playing dead. It's a profound shutdown. It's actually kind of like a relaxation response.
And very, very adaptive in that situation.
Totally adaptive, because if the carnivorous animal thinks that that's dead carrion, it won't actually attack it. So plays dead, and then the animal moves on, and then it gets up and goes. The other kind of freeze response, which is, and humans do have that sort of freeze, play dead response, but the more common thing that people refer to when they talk about freeze is seizing up, not knowing what to do, just totally going blank. And that's often associated with stress or confusion or agitation.
About to give a presentation or something like that.
Yeah, it's not adaptive. Totally, it's sort of like a kangaroo in the headlights. And that's not actually particularly helpful. And that's when the executive functioning area of the brain sort of is often overwhelmed by the amygdala, which is the stress center in the brain, and that really takes off. And so that's not a very helpful response. So those two things are quite different.
Yeah. Speaking about animals, training the puppy was a very useful metaphor for a lot of people this week. And this attitude of being gentle with ourselves. I mean, implicit in mindfulness is this attitude of non-judgment. That's one of the first things we start to practice, just to notice the mind's wandering, that it's busy, and then just to bring it back without any judgment. You know, a further step from that is to actually start cultivating being gentle. And so that training the puppy metaphor is a really useful one for learning to actually just very kindly, gently and patiently bring our attention back to what's happening in the present moment. And people find that when they do that, their mind starts to calm down, and it actually makes it much easier to focus. And of course, anything that we practice gets hardwired into the brain. So if we're cultivating attitudes like patience and gentleness and friendliness, then we just become that more in our lives. And actually, next week we'll look at self-compassion, which is a step further yet again, really cultivating these attitudes of unconditional friendliness towards ourselves.
Yeah. A lot of learners are noticing their tendency to be self-critical. This is an aspect of noticing more and more of the default activity we've got running in our heads, the kinds of commentaries, the kinds of criticisms. I remember one time a lady came along in a 6-week course. It was probably about week 5, I think, and she said, "I just had a revelation this week. I've never noticed it before, but as I go about my day-to-day life, there's this sarcastic, critical sort of background commentary going." And she said, "I never realised that that's pretty much running my whole life. Every time I do something, there's this voice that goes, yeah, and it's got something to say about it." Now, if we're actually noticing that and noticing it more often, then that's a sign of being mindful.
Yeah.
But it's especially mindful if we notice it without judgment or criticism, not even thinking that it shouldn't be there, but make a discerning choice for ourselves. Is that really where I need my attention to be? So it'd be like if you're walking along the street and somebody was talking a whole lot of nonsense. You don't stop and start arguing with them and why are you talking like that and everything else, because you'll waste your whole day. You might just sort of notice, not interested, and just walk on by. And we can do that with our thoughts in a way, this kind of commentary. But this is actually a very useful sign that people are noticing that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And there was a little bit of conversation about unnecessary worrying as well.
It's all unnecessary.
Well, it's a good point, actually, isn't it? Yeah, which is, of course, very different to planning and actually thinking intentionally about what we're going to be doing in the future. I mean, it's one thing to sit down and make a list of things that you need to do that day and to think about what needs to be done. And it's another thing entirely to get into worrying about it and dwelling on it and really getting caught up in the kind of thinking that activates the stress response.
I can remember the New Zealand All Blacks beat Australia in the final of the Rugby World Cup. And Australia was coming back pretty strongly at one stage in the second half there. And anyway, New Zealand pulled away, but they interviewed the New Zealand coach afterwards, and said, "Oh, look, you're getting worried, when Australia was coming back." And he just looked at me blankly and said, "Worry is a wasted emotion." And it's like, why invest your time and energy in that? But we do. And it's part of the human condition, but it just happens so habitually.
And in that situation, I mean, it would cloud his judgment. What's the point in worrying? The team's doing what they're doing. If anything, he needs to maintain a really calm, clear perspective. And what's if he starts to worry, he's going to activate his stress response, amygdala, whatever, lose concentration. So just not a very useful way of functioning.
No. And a number of learners have noticed things like getting annoyed at cells getting stressed, getting annoyed about this reactivity. And I often find it's a real breakthrough in courses when people start to describe what they're noticing about themselves, but not with annoyance, but with amusement. It's sort of like, look. And if people can come along in a group and just share, "Oh, look, I did this week. Oh, you should have seen me doing this. I can't believe it. I created so many catastrophes." Once we start to see the funny side of it or get amused rather than annoyed, it really starts to loosen it up a little bit. It really loses a lot of its traction. But getting annoyed actually just adds another layer.
Yeah. Judging the judgment, so to speak. Watching the clock as well came up. A few people meditating and finding, when's this going to be over kind of thing, which of course, I mean, where's your attention in those moments? Is it actually on the breath or on the body, or is it, 5 minutes into the future? So just noticing that as well is a really useful thing to do, and to recognise that in those moments, are you practicing mindfulness or something else that's masquerading as mindfulness? And just to notice that and come back over and over again. That's the practice.
Yeah. And and too, it's not just during meditation, but watching the clock throughout our life, and that means we miss the moment, like the eternal present, I suppose.
Plus, we can all, I'm sure, remember sitting in class back in high school, watching the clock, and it's 3:10 and it's 3:11, and it takes half an hour for each minute to go by. Whereas when we're in the moment, time flies. When we're just actually engaged and present. So not such a good strategy. This came up in my course last night, people starting to worry about, if I'm not constantly thinking about what is next and worrying about stuff, I'm going to become really apathetic. I'm just going to whatever, man. And so we were having this interesting conversation about the difference between, letting go of worry and just being present and getting things done, and being apathetic.
So there's a kind of a distinction that we need to draw between being relaxed, apathetic, in which case we wouldn't get much done, and stress lifts us out of that. But and this will come up later in the course but being inwardly calm but engaged, identifying what our priorities are, and to be in touch with our real values, the things that are really important to us. And I think that's an important part of what it means to be mindful, to be committed to the things that we really value, and to engage with those, and not to be easily put off or swayed by just the internal weather in terms of our apathy and so on, or external conditions that sometimes make it difficult. So I really think the kind of burn, if you like, that comes with being mindful is a slow combustion that doesn't burn itself out quickly. Sometimes people burn with passion about something, get all stressed and anxious about it, and it's a little flurry for 5 minutes, but it really doesn't have anything sustainable, and all the fuel burns out very quickly. So it's a sort of slow burn that can maintain itself, I think, is a really important part of being focused and direct, but calmly addressing the real things that you value in life.
Yeah, there's a real difference between being mindful and being apathetic. I mean, mindfulness is increased engagement with each moment in our lives, whereas apathy is a sort of a disengagement and not caring. So they're very different things. So we can definitely become more mindful without becoming apathetic, and we don't need to be constantly worrying about things, or even planning. That came up as well. And I guess this is related. What about planning? If mindfulness is about being present and engaged, obviously we have to plan for the future. We have to remember what happened. We have to be able to think about what's going on in the present moment. So from time to time, that's actually very useful to do. But to do it intentionally is, of course, the secret, because quite often the mind just defaults into the future and the past and starts to ruminate, and we think we're planning, but we're actually worrying and obsessing about things and going over and over things. And so to have some awareness of where our attention is from moment to moment means that we can just start to plan deliberately. We sit down and we think, what do I need to do today? We make that list, and then we get focused on the first thing on the list, rather than just spinning our wheels, so to speak.
Yeah. And if we're walking through the park, we could walk through the park and plan if we wanted to, instead of listening to the birds or feeling the gravel and smelling the scent of the what's ever in flower. We could do that. And it may be useful, it may be necessary. We may find it's better to use that time of just walking from point A to point B to clear the mind. And then when we sit down, actually in a more focused way, more intentionally plan and prepare. But there's no hard and fast rule about this. But this sort of cognitive fatigue of the mind, always worrying and never giving it a break, just even in simple moments, can certainly come at a cost.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, there were some related comments about mindfulness in anxiety-provoking situations, being passengers in cars, that kind of thing. So that's an interesting thing to comment on, I think.
Yeah.
Quite often the situation itself is not actually what's causing us the stress. I mean, if there's a hungry tiger in front of us, that's objectively a stressful situation, and we'd want to be, very tense and in a fight and flight response there. But quite often it's got to get up on stage and present, or there's a job interview, or we're sitting in traffic, or there's something else. And in those moments, if we're feeling tense and stressed, I guess we really want to start to notice, okay, what's going on in our minds that's giving rise to this tension? What are we imagining? What are the reactions, the judgments? What's our attention caught up in? Because it's probably not just actually focused on the driving or the situation that we're in or the activity that we're engaged in. It's probably caught up in some kind of reactivity or imagining or something like that.
It's been mentioned about panic attacks as well. And being mindful in a panic attack is certainly possible, but not easy.
No.
To just be present in an accepting, non-reactive way with something we find very uncomfortable is pretty challenging. If we practice that, we get better at it. But what we also need to do is look at what's going on prior to the panic attack, what's going on in our day-to-day life. Because very often, the panic attack's one thing, but it's the excess adrenaline we're often just building up, getting apprehensive about things and so on, that primes the body with a lot of adrenaline. It sits around in the heart muscle and elsewhere, and it only takes a trigger for it to release, and bang, the event's happening. So what we need to do is just reduce our general level of adrenaline that we're pumping out every day. If we're hurrying unnecessarily, just come back and move no faster than we need to get where we're going. If we're worrying about the future again, we catch it, we'll just come back to the present, because it's those thousands of little things that prime the event for panic attack. If we undo that thousands of times, then we're not just reducing the adrenaline, but we're also quietening down stress centres in the brain, and we're making it less likely this is going to happen again in the future.
Yes, yeah. A few of the learners talked about, particularly doing the body scan, Craig, the difficulty actually feeling their body, and they start to imagine it or visualise it or that kind of thing. Did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to notice that, how unconnected with our body we are. Like if we just asked you to just sort of stroke the back of your hand, you would notice a sensation on the back of the hand. Now the feeling of that sensation is different to thinking about it or imagining it. And or trying to picture that part of the body. When we sit in the chair and practice mindfulness meditation, and the mind, rather than connecting with the sensory tactile experience, is actually thinking and imagining like it is in a habit of doing. Certainly we shouldn't get critical of that, but we do actually want to practice coming back to that raw sensation, because that's the thing that cuts through that default thinking and gets us engaged in the present moment.
I find it when I'm teaching mindfulness, and I'm sure you must too, that sometimes that imagining is like training wheels. In the beginning, people are so disconnected from their body that to imagine it is useful. Or some people count the breath, or they're thinking kind of in, out, that kind of thing. But I often encourage them as quickly as they can to let go of that extra little bit of processing and just actually get in touch directly with what's happening.
And if the mind does that sort of thing, labelling and thinking and commenting on the practice as it's going along, there's no need to comment on that or to judge that. Just to note it and gently come back to the sensation. Note it again, gently back to the sensation. So in a way, each time just more gently, more simply, so that that distraction that the mind, sort of comes up with creates less and less disturbance as time goes on.
Yeah, because it's a habit, isn't it? It's a strong habit of the mind to be labelling and judging and evaluating everything all the time, which is actually what takes us out of the present moment and causes a lot of our problems. So if we can practice letting go of them, then that's a very useful thing to do. Yeah. Gardening came up, is that? Yeah.
Yes.
So somebody was saying that when they're gardening, that feels like a very mindful experience. And they then went on to say that their mind happily wanders off in all kinds of different directions and they're daydreaming about this and that. And I mean, I guess you'd really sort of argue that that's maybe not mindfulness. You know, it's grounding ourselves in the soil, you know, literally grounding ourselves. But if the mind's wandering, then that's not really being mindful. The awareness of that, you know, for the learner that really started to notice this, that's mindfulness, to notice, oh, my mind's wandering everywhere. But the point of mindfulness isn't actually to just let the mind wander and and that kind of thing. It's actually to be more engaged and present, to notice that mind wandering and bring it back. You know, suddenly the fingers are back in the soil and aware of what's happening around us. So.
Yes, that's right. And the same for any informal practice of mindfulness. Curiosity was a big theme that came up, and it's a wonderful thing if it does, because we often lose our curiosity. It always amazes me that young children are just so curious. They're they're living in a world that's full of miracles, and I don't know what happens. It's not like the miracles aren't there, but we just stop seeing them. We lose our curiosity.
We just lose touch with it. We never really lose it, do we? We just somehow, life gets faster and we start relating to the world through concepts and ideas rather than directly through the senses, and so we lose touch with it.
And I think too, for a lot of kids being brought up and they're living their life through an iPad and so on from very early on, and if they haven't got constant stimulation there, it's like, I'm bored.
Yep.
And they're sort of, rather than being curious, rather than being interested. And there's a quote, I think it was Chesterton said, there are no uninteresting things, there are only uninterested people. And we really dull our minds by not being curious and not being interested. And you wouldn't find somebody like an Einstein doing that. He just had this sort of childlike fascination throughout the whole of his life, and extraordinary character. So bringing that curiosity into our lives and being curious about ourselves, being curious about what we're noticing, being interested. We discover ourselves, but we also discover more about the world.
Know thyself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And of course, you know, as you said, that begins sometimes with meditation, just being curious about something mundane like breathing or, you know, maybe eating or travelling or that kind of thing. But pretty quickly we can start to actually cultivate that in other areas. Students at the university here often find some of their classes obviously really interesting, other classes really boring. But we often ask the question, is it the class itself or is it your approach to the class? And if you find one thing that you're interested in that so-called boring class, does that then maybe lead to a little bit more engagement and therefore more curiosity? It becomes quite a circular thing.
Yes.
And I also really like the inquiry as as a method. In mindfulness, when we're teaching, we're often resisting the temptation to answer people's questions. And so if people ask us directly, you know, a question, we'll often just put it back on them, you know, to find out for themselves, because mindfulness gives us a tool for actually inquiring into our own experience and discovering for ourselves what the effect of doing certain things is, of feeding certain thoughts and emotions. So very powerful thing to do, just to sort of, to not know, to suspend judgment, to approach things with an open, or sometimes you could say beginner's mind, and just to be curious about what's actually happening.
Yes.
Finally, a few learners are repeating the course this time around, and that's been really great to hear from them. And a few of them have even said that they're getting a lot more out of it the second time around, because they're delving into the literature a little bit more, doing some of the optional extra readings, and engaging more in the forum, in the conversation. So that's obviously something that we'd encourage everybody to do, including the people doing it for the first time. You know, really make the most of this 6 weeks.
Yeah.
So from Richard and Craig, we'd just like to thank you once again. Thanks to Jen and Sherelle, to all of the learners for the conversations, to all the team helping put this course together, and we'll see you next week.